As countries across sub-Saharan Africa grapple with the challenges of sustaining high levels of economic growth, plunging commodity prices and the effects of climate change, revitalizing agriculture must become a priority on the continent. Africa is home to nearly half of the world's arable land, and farming provides up to 60% of all jobs on the continent. But experts predict that food production in sub-Saharan Africa needs to increase by at least 60% over the next decade to feed a bulging population. So how can the continent capitalize on one of its biggest assets? And what steps are needed to transform Africa's agriculture? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Well, experts are warning that the drought in southern Africa is likely to be exacerbated by the possible La Nina weather phenomenon set to hit before the end of the year. La Nina is characterized by unusually cold ocean temperatures. Like its counterpart, El Nino, the extreme weather pattern is a result of climate change. Humanitarian agencies are concerned already drought-stricken southern African countries will not be able to cope with the deteriorating conditions.
It's the worst drought to hit southern Africa in 3 decades, and millions of people are affected.
High probability of La Nina phenomenon toward the end of this year. It is likely that the situation will be exacerbate and coping capacity in most of these countries will be further eroded.
Food supplies in Madagascar and Malawi are exhausted, and there's limited access to safe drinking water. Other severely affected countries include Angola, Lesotho, Mozambique, Swaziland and Zimbabwe. Humanitarian agencies are appealing for more than $1 billion to help those in need.
We really rely on the generosity of donors and other partners to support the governments and demonstrate their continued commitment to saving lives as well as restoring livelihoods of those affected.
Food insecurity is expected to peak between October 2016 and March 2017. Extreme weather conditions such as drought and floods have increased in frequency and severity in recent years, mainly due to climate change. Susan Mogeli, CCTV.
And in the wake of the drought in much of southern Africa, I spoke to Mrs. Tumusime Roda Peace. She's the Commissioner for Rural Economy and Agriculture at the African Union Commission about what is being done and the policies in place to improve Africa's agricultural potential. Commissioner, thank you very much for your time. Let's start by looking at the food security situation in Africa, because there are reports of devastating droughts in southern Africa, in parts of the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa region. What is the exact situation of Africa's food security?
Thank you very much for asking that question. You know, we must have food on the continent. If we have to develop, food security is extremely important. Unfortunately, we have had a challenge. We have had a challenge of climate change. Africa has suffered the biggest El Nino in the last 50 years. The whole of Southern Africa and partly Eastern Africa. So the countries from Eastern African region to Southern Africa, all of them have suffered food insecurity, but to the varying degree. For example, the Southern African countries and also Ethiopia have had more challenges than other countries, because also it depends on how much El Nino hit them, how much drought. Like Ethiopia, they suffered a lot of drought. Like the countries in Southern Africa, they had very intense drought, which we have not seen for a long time. We saw livestock in South Africa die, collapse and die. The grass was all dissipated. We saw the countries like Malawi, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia all suffer the same fate. Even Namibia, even Angola. So really, the whole of Southern Africa, I think we have to look at how we can mitigate the challenge of climate change.
We can no longer, though, talk about Africa now largely depending on rain-fed agriculture, even though Africa does still depend on rain-fed agriculture. But 60% of arable land is in Africa. What is it, though, that is preventing Africa and the Africans themselves from exploiting this resource?
You know, Africa has got a framework for agriculture. That is the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program. Now, in their recent also commitment, after 10 years of the first CADAP in Malabo, they came up and said, no, agriculture remains a key sector for us. We must ensure that we use agriculture to reduce poverty by 50%. We must end hunger by 20-25%. We must increase agricultural trade within Africa by 50%. So they have had ready to come up and say, no, we must put in more. So to go back to your question, we must use this potential which we have and really get agriculture moving. We must have agricultural transformation. We haven't done that yet. But if all these, which we have now worked on after Malabo declaration of those commitments, which are very, very important, they are variable, and every 2 years they have to be accounted for. Each country has to report back where they are. So I believe that very soon or later, things are going to be really in the way they should be.
What will it take, though, to revolutionize Africa's agriculture? Because Africa now has access to technology that it can tap into.
You know, our food import bill is between 35 and 40 billion dollars. If that money is put in agriculture, by the way, annually we need only less than $30 billion. We need about $20 billion. So what it needs really to modernize the agricultural sector on the continent is to put in place all those mechanisms. We must ensure that we really mechanize. We have value chain development. We bring on board the private sector. We have to get the women not using the hand hoe, but also come into the mainstream of agro-processing and agribusiness, so that at least we move the agricultural sector.
We had to move the agricultural sector. One of the issues, of course, that's been an issue for Africa's farmers is finding a market. At the end of it all, where is that market going to be found? Where is the market? Because internationally, African produce is still locked out. Where is that market for Africa's products?
By the way, let me tell you, we trade within Africa very, very in a small margin. We trade by fact, I think, about 13%. So we have a market in Africa. If we can trade within ourselves, there is increasing urbanization. There is the population growth, which is going very, very high. All those are opportunities. So we need to organize ourselves, have storage, cold storage facilities in town, put our supermarkets more in a modern manner, and put all our products moving from the rural area to the supermarkets. The markets are available. We don't even have to go to Europe.
A final comment from you, Commissioner. The one issue that, if you were to mention one issue that would revolutionize Africa's agriculture, what would that be? What would need to be done?
The countries I have seen which have done well, what has made them stars is the leadership. Leadership is very, very critical for Africa's agriculture. The leader must take it very, very seriously to ensure that agriculture is really given its rightful place in the economy.
Commissioner, thank you.
Thank you too.
But while many across the continent are feeling the effects of climate change, there are those who are being proactive about it. The Western Cape government in South Africa recently launched a groundbreaking climate change response strategy known as Smart Agri. The comprehensive climate change response plan sets out a roadmap to combat the impact of extreme weather events on the province's agricultural sector.
This is the Langevens Research Farm near Cape Town, where researchers are working hard to try and mitigate the effects of climate change on agriculture. The 500-hectare farm lies in the Swartland, which is mainly known as a wheat and grape-growing region. Researchers here are desperately trying to turn things around after the devastating drought which started last year.
2015 was a very dry year in the Swartland, in this area where the farm is situated, for instance. We had a green, we call it a green drought, where the season started late, we had initial good rains, and then everything cut off. But with the way we are farming currently, it actually helped us still producing a yield, whereas in previous dry years, we didn't produce anything.
For us, it's about planting and harvesting. The rain has been low many times over the years, but the rain events still allowed us to produce good yields. But in a year such as last year, we started off well and ended on a very weak note.
As part of the AgriSmart project, the farm is constantly trying to become more green. It uses low carbon and resilient production systems to try and lessen the effect of carbon emissions. But the main focus is on conserving every drop of water.
We focus on the 3 pillars of conservation agriculture, which is minimum disturbance of the soil, crop diversity through rotation systems, and a maximum cover of the soil by either a living plant or plant residue following harvest. We are a water scarce country, so we have to build resilient systems, and we use our production in such a way that we can manage the little we get to the fullest.
The Swartland has always been a winter rainfall region. But as a result of climate change, rain events have become more and more unpredictable and sporadic. That's why researchers here are constantly trying to find better ways to retain water in the soil. Conservation researchers say lower production levels would mean less food and possibly fewer jobs in the agricultural sector.
I've been here for 22 years, and I've never experienced such a drought. You know, there have been droughts. At one point, they said a nearby dam was only 18% full, and we had to work together to save water. And I've never known things to be like this.
And no one here wants to see such a dry, unproductive season. Renadal Calm, CCTV, Langewens in South Africa's Western Cape province.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, my expert guests will offer insights into the process of transforming Africa's agriculture. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, to add more insight into how Africa can transform its agricultural sector, I have expert guests standing by in Johannesburg. Michael Sudekasa is the CEO at Africa Business Group in Nairobi. Dr. James Okeno is the Products Stewardship Manager at the African Agricultural Technology Foundation. And with me in studio is Dr. Richard Monang. He's the Africa Regional Climate Change Coordinator at UNEP here in Nairobi. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Michael Sudekasa in Johannesburg, let's start off with you. And the situation generally in southern African countries. As many as 49 million people are said to be facing a severe drought, the worst in 35 years. As an example of what's going on in Africa, what is the fate now of Africa's agriculture?
Well, you started off with one of the big challenges of the continent, which is the impact of climate change and El Nino. And I think that we really have to guard how we move forward in the agricultural sector in terms of what we can do to mitigate that impact. Our topic about transformation is critical because one of the challenges that we have on the continent is that we don't utilize mechanization, we don't utilize technology, we don't utilize storage adequately. And so we are really at the whims of Mother Nature. We don't utilize irrigation, which really could change a lot on the continent. So the state of agriculture on the continent basically is on the uprise, but we have to really start paying more attention to how we address climate change and its impact. And I think our focus today on transformation is really the direction that we need to go in. We need climate resilient seeds. I mentioned we need irrigation and we need storage.
Dr. Munang, we are at the mercy of Mother Nature, and the United Nations itself predicts that by 2030 droughts will leave the continent at least with 40% less arable land. With what we know now in terms of climate change, what are we doing about it?
Thank you very much, Beatrice, for having me in studio. I think the point of what we are doing about it from the African perspective today is quite very crucial, because agricultural transformation in a continent cannot be considered in isolation with the climate stressors which are already impacting the continent through the El Ninos in Southern Africa and Eastern Africa, as we see. However, in moving forward with the different actions that are taking place, this cannot be considered in isolation of climate change and also ecological degradation. The African gap report, which was produced by UNEP last year, shows that agricultural production will decrease by up to about 40%. And at the same time today, the continent is losing $68 billion yearly as a result of land degradation. So moving forward with the changing climate and at the same time with the ecological degradation, which is costing $68 billion, it is therefore imperative to ensure that any action that is being put in place to ensure agricultural transformation should take into consideration nature approaches that is working with nature and not against nature.
Right. Dr. Okenno, what are we getting right on the continent? What aren't we getting right in terms of our agricultural processes?
So, Beatrice, this is what I have to say. African agriculture is facing a lot of challenges. And one of them has been mentioned, that is the Mother Nature, the effect of drought, floods, and so on. But I also want to say, Beatrice, that African agriculture has to come back to the development agenda by our able leaders, bring it to the development agenda. Now, to do this, African agriculture has to adopt prevailing new technologies that have been developed. The African farms are known for producing less per unit area, that is the yield, meaning we have inferior crop types, or which we call in science hybrids or varieties. Now, to adopt technology, technologies is coming in many forms. One of them is the use of the hybrids as a crop type instead of what we call the land races that our parents or forefathers were using. So we start putting more money in research and development to develop new crop types. Now, we also have other factors that really pull down our or depress our yields.
We will come back to the whole issue, Dr. Okenno. We'll come back with that issue of what is depressing our yields. But for now, I just want to come back to you, Michael Sudekasa, because there are varied points in this discussion here. One of them, you've talked about transforming Africa's agriculture, and Dr. Okenno has talked about low yields. How do we transform Africa's agriculture?
Well, I mentioned that we are at a point where increasing numbers of stakeholders on the continent and our partners off the continent are focused on how we can add value to our crops, how we can make sure our crops are more resilient. I mentioned the utilization of mechanization, the utilization of irrigation, using better seeds, which my colleague started talking about as well. These are all ways that we're transforming agriculture. We used to use the hoe, and we're moving away from farming with the hoe. The theme is to banish the hoe to the museum, and so that we can also bring in young people to transform agriculture. The average age of a farmer on the continent now is upwards of 55 years. To feed our continent for the next 50 years and beyond, we're going to have younger farmers. And so part of the whole idea of transforming agriculture includes also having younger stakeholders. We have urban farming, people farming in containers, so that you can basically make sure that you can protect against Mother Nature, as I mentioned. So how do we use hydroponics and how do we use greenhouses? These are all areas that are starting to become more prevalent on the continent, which help us transform agriculture.
Dr. Manang, of course, experts will continue pointing a finger at climate change as one of the reasons that Africa faces such a huge food deficit. Are there viable options here now for the continent?
Absolutely, so many viable options. If you look at the continent today, it actually contains 65% of uncultivated arable land. And if you look at the unemployed youth, as Michael mentioned, there are about 200 million youths, and with 60% of them unemployed today. But if you look at how the jobs will be created, the continent is providing a lot of opportunities, and if you dovetail this within the African Union Agenda 2063 and also the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the post-Paris Agreement on climate change, which provides an opportunity to be able to tap into renewable energy, into sun, into wind, into solar. All these could actually be used not only to expand the entire agro-value chain, but at the same time also to set up what we call agro-industrialization in rural areas, where 80% of the food that we depend on in the continent today is produced by smallholder farmers, and most of them women. So decentralizing renewable energy so that agro-industrialization could be set up in rural areas today will not only help to create jobs for the youth, but at the same time also help spur ingenuity and economic opportunities, which will help the continent to be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as also their climate mitigation options, which they actually gave these in the form of what is called intended national determined contributions.
And I come back to that whole question of seed management there, Dr. Okenno, because we've heard that 80% of the food produced is produced in the rural areas where, I mean, land is probably 1 hectare or less. How do you grow your food, though, first to feed the population and also for economic growth, enough for economic growth?
Yes, Beatrice, what we need to do is to make that land, irrespective of its size, to produce its potential. Now, to produce its potential, I started by saying, let's give it the right crop type. That's one way of looking at it. So we're still going to have production or productivity per unit area. So irrespective of whether it is just 1 hectare or a half an hectare or a quarter hectare, we have to produce to its potential. The other thing we have to look at in terms of climate change is to adopt look at agriculture holistically. I mean, adopt the smart agriculture in terms of in this way. So you have the right variety. The other thing we need to have, actually, Africa is described as having less water sources, so the dams and rivers. Then we need to really store any little water that we have that's available, and also use it efficiently. So we could also adopt technologies like drip irrigation, even at the small scale land holding system. This is possible. This works out. The other thing that I want to conclude on that, conclude that topic on, is African agriculture is highly diversified. Whereas we talk of green revolution in the 60s in Southeast Asia and Latin America, they were only dealing with the 2 types of crops, that is rice and wheat. Very easy for scientists to adopt, to breed and improve on them easily. When you come to Africa, you are talking of many crops, and these have to be done right at whatever land size.
Well, I'll come back, though, to Michael Sudekasi there, because Dr. Okenno, you've mentioned a point about investing in our agriculture there. Michael, you're a proponent of investing in agriculture. What kind of investments are we talking about here that can transform that agricultural sector?
Well, I keep coming back to the area of infrastructure as a key one that we need. I appreciate the comment from Dr. Manang about investing or developing our renewable energy capacity to create agro-industrial zones in rural areas. I mean, this is an initiative that countries like Nigeria, countries like the DRC are taking very seriously. We have to also, as I mentioned earlier, store our food. We lose something like 40 to 50% of our food to post-harvest losses because there's no place in the hot sun to store. We don't have adequate cold chain. We don't have adequate silos. So for me, a lot of that should be in the infrastructure space. The other area that is ripe for investment is also in the input space. So we talk about fertilizer, we talk about better seeds, we talk about utilizing agrochemicals. That's a key area. And then lastly, skills. We really need to improve the capacity of our young people. ICT is becoming a greater part of the agricultural and agribusiness development paradigm. And so we need farmers and we need people in the value chain who understand how to use technology. So those three areas are critical areas for me in terms of investment.
Right. Dr. Munang, if all these views are put together, do you think Africa can feed itself? Africa is still importing about $35 billion worth of food every year.
Absolutely. Africa could feed itself and the entire world. And if you look at the different solutions that are happening across Africa today, it is not the absence of ideas, it's not the absence of innovation. What has actually been lacking in the continent has been a lack of an implementation platform that is inclusive, that bring all stakeholders together, the private sector, the civil society, the NGOs, the policymakers, the youth, and even individual citizens. And so having an inclusive implementation framework that brings the bits and pieces and ensure that investment can actually be channeled into the right areas within the entire agro value chain could actually work. And in July 2015, the UN Environment Programme, in collaboration with partners across the continent, created what is called the Ecosystem-Based Adaptation for Food Security Assembly, whereby each country is domesticating this at the national level and ensuring that every stakeholder is brought together. Because if you look at the entire agro value chain, on-farm production, you have farmers, but in the middle, you also need the private sector to come in with technologies through ICTs, through renewable energy. And you also need policymakers to be able to incentivize and create an enabling environment for the private sector to be able to help these farmers. And then you need markets, you need roads, and you need all this happening on a changing climate, but in a way that are not adding to the emissions. So alternatively, with what we have today, Africa could actually feed the world. But there is a last point, which is about financing. The continent doesn't lack the resources. The continent is losing about $60 billion every year as a result of illicit financial flows. And also the continent is benefiting from diaspora financing, which every year diaspora remittances, which in 2016 it is estimated that 42 billion will actually come into the continent as a result of these remittances. So what needs to be done is that the private sector, especially commercial banks, should look into those who are receiving these remittances, and most of them smallholder farmers. Right. Can they be able, based on the amount of money they are receiving, then be given some loans that are tapped into the agricultural sector, especially those who are utilizing agricultural approaches that are working with nature and not destroying the environment, giving loans at low interest rate. And lastly, there is what is called the risk-sharing facility, which is quite very instrumental in actually spurring lending in the agricultural sector. And Nigeria has actually piloted this, developing a risk-sharing facility in the agricultural sector, which, if it is integrated with other risk-reducing approaches like the ecosystem-based adaptation, could actually reach out to so many millions of farmers. So Africa have the tools and actually the opportunities to feed itself and the world.
Dr. Munang, we'll have to leave it there for the moment, and that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Johannesburg, Michael Tudakasa, he's the CEO at Africa Business Group. In Nairobi, Dr. James Okeno, he's a product stewardship manager at the African Agricultural Technology Foundation. And with me here in studio is Dr. Richard Munang. He's the Africa Regional Climate Change Coordinator at UNEP here in Nairobi. Thank you very much for your insights. And remember, you can join the conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And to join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.